Hey everybody, this is chapter 8 of Dirk Braunstein's Adorno's Critique of Political Economy, translated by Adam Baltner. Chapter 8 is titled Garbage, and the sections include Section 1, Not a Single Missing Link, Section 2, No Happiness Without Fetishism, and Section 3, What is Deceptive About Dialogue? Alright, so let's rock. It starts with a quote. And I want to try to read this thing in German. And it's translated, but I'm going to read it in German just because I'd like to work on that. So I'm sorry you have to listen to it. Zum Beispiel, dass man beinahe nichts or nichts bekommt, wenn man nicht zahlt, dass niemand jemand irgendetwas glaubt, wenn man nicht zahlt, auch wenn der pünktlich gereifte mich laut Gefühl verhünt, nach hab ich mich an nichts gewöhnt. Thank you for bearing with me through that. Take, for example, that you get basically nothing if you don't pay, or that no one ever takes your word for anything if you don't show off. Even though people who act their age might make fun of me, I've never gotten used to anything. And that quote is from Heinz Rudolf Kunze, from a piece titled Nach hab ich mich an nicht gewöhnt. Or at least that's my best pronunciation of it. And I have no idea what that translates as. Section 1, Not a Single Missing Link. In a letter from October 1947, Adorno writes to his parents regarding his work on, quote, a very long manuscript written in the Nietzschean aphoristic form, relating to a relatively wide range of philosophical objects, but above all the question of what has fundamentally become of, quote, life under the conditions of monopoly capitalism, end quote. Letter from Adorno to his parents, 31st of October, 1945. I'm not sure which is correct here. The sentence says October 1947. The citation says October 1945, so who knows? After all, as Adorno states in Minima Moralia, Reflections on Damaged Life, the title under which the, quote, very long manuscript, end quote, was eventually published, the, quote, perspective of life, end quote, formerly the genuine substance of all philosophy, quote, has passed into an ideology which conceals the fact that there is life no longer, end quote. Adorno. A comparison of Adorno's aphorism titled Vandals with the aphorism Leisure and Idleness by Nietzsche reveals Minima Moralia not only to be formally the, quote, most Nietzschean, end quote, of Adorno's works, that quotes from Martin J., but also at times to come quite close substantively to Nietzsche as well. In the Vandals article, Adorno writes the following, or the Vandals aphorism. Adorno writes the following, quote, everybody must have projects all the time. The maximum must be extracted from leisure. This is planned, used for undertakings, crammed with visits to every conceivable sight or spectacle, or just with the fastest possible locomotion. The shadow of all this falls on intellectual work. It is done with a bad conscience, as if it had been poached from some urgent, even if only imaginary, occupation. End quote. Adorno. Footnote. Elsewhere, Adorno remarks along these lines that, quote, the principle of conduct, and as, quote, doing, end quote, as accomplishing, ultimately as, end society's production process, is, end finally traceable back to the figure of the busy person, end quote. Even going so far as to say that, quote, for the bourgeois, vitality equals business in getting something done, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. This echoes an observation Nietzsche made in the 19th century, quote, already one is ashamed of keeping still. Long reflection almost gives people a bad conscience. One thinks with a watch in hand, as one eats lunch with an eye on the financial pages. One lives like someone who might always, quote, miss out on something, end quote. Quote, rather do anything than nothing, end quote. Even this principle is a cord to strangle all culture and all higher taste, end quote. Gotta fuck that up. ... It's not the end of the quote. It's still the same quote. For life in a hunt for profit constantly forces people to expend their spirit to the point of exhaustion. ... More and more, work gets all good conscience on its side. The desire for joy already calls itself a, quote, need to recuperate, end quote, and is starting to be ashamed of itself. Quote, one owes it to one's health, end quote. That is what one says when caught on an excursion in the countryside. Soon we may well reach the point where one can't give in to the desire for a vita contemplativa, that is, taking a walk with ideas and friends, without self-contempt and bad conscience. End quote. Nietzsche. That's a great peak quote. In general, the substantive proximity between Adorno and Nietzsche can be described thusly. Both understand modernity along with its capitalist forms of intercourse not as an open opportunity for genuine enlightenment, but as one which has already been wasted. Just like Adorno, Nietzsche views the course of human history from the standpoint of the immediate present, in order to interpret it as a failed attempt at self-liberation from mythology. In other words, he too recognizes the dialectic in enlightenment. Footnote. Henning Ottman identifies 3 developmental phases in Nietzsche's philosophy of enlightenment. Quote, 1. The free thinking, Freigeisterei, which becomes 2. The critique of enlightenment by enlightenment in order to ultimately give way to 3. An ambiguous, quote, new enlightenment, end quote, which is to be understood as both the critique of enlightenment as well as enlightenment's regeneration, end quote. Henning Ottman. End footnote. Quote, Nietzsche had pushed the idea of the Enlightenment to the limit and to its reversal. Nietzsche obscured nothing but cried to the world that no argument against murder could be deduced from unfettered reason. Like critical theory, Nietzsche recognized that Enlightenment had turned into Enlightenment's opposite, and Nietzsche then attempted to master chaos with an exaggerated individualism. End quote. Putz, 1981. In his lecture course titled Problems of Moral Philosophy, Adorno says of Nietzsche that, quote, Of all the so-called great philosophers, I owe him by far the greatest debt, even more than to Hegel. End quote. Do you need help?
I don't think so.
Okay. Adorno does criticize Nietzsche for having, quote, lacked the concept of determinate negation, end quote, arguing that, quote, if one counterposes an other to that which is recognized as negative, this other must contain in a new form that which is negated, end quote. Adorno. Nevertheless, Adorno maintains that Nietzsche's work, quote, really does involve the attempt, born out of despair over what was once recognized as bad, to simultaneously conjure up and counterpose a new order, new values as he always referred to it, out of nothing. One can say that it is a thinking which relentlessly sprouts aerial roots, end quote. Adorno. And there's a footnote that I missed. It says, on his own appropriation of Nietzsche's philosophy, and especially of Nietzsche's critique of metaphysics, see Adorno 2000, quote, I recall my own early experience as a schoolboy when I first came across Nietzsche, who, as any of you are familiar with his work, are familiar with this work will know, is not sparing in his complaints about metaphysics, ... When I sought the advice of someone considerably older than myself, I was told that it was too early for me to understand metaphysics, but that I would be able to do so one day, ... So that the naive postponement and procrastination that I experience is not really so accidental. It seems to me something to do with the subject matter itself, and especially with the general procedure which philosophy adopts in relation to metaphysics. End quote. Adorno. And footnote. Where am I? Adorno's verdict on Nietzsche in this passage is probably not quite correct, for as Henning Ottman emphasizes, Nietzsche's late theory, quote, lends itself to being misunderstood in two ways, as mere anti-enlightenment and as mere scientific anti-mythology, end quote. Whereas, quote, it should be regarded as enlightening the, quote, fallacies, end quote, of religion, metaphysics and morality on the one hand, and is drawing upon the power of myth on the other, end quote. Ottman. The tendency to fundamentally misunderstand Nietzsche would seem to have far more to do with Nietzsche's own failure to recognize that what, quote, he himself called life, end quote, is inadequate for achieving what Adorno refers to as determinate negation, something which can only be accomplished via the whole which dominates, quote, life, end quote. Marx discovered the overreaching coercive mechanisms in effect between all individuals in society, mechanisms which classify individuals and which in doing so ultimately give society its specific capitalist form. From here, Adorno goes on to examine both the manner in which society's coercion of socialized individuals takes place and the results of this coercion. This marks a shift in focus onto questions concerning individuality's conditions and possibilities, its expressions in professional life, leisure time, art, culture, sport, consumption, and daily routine, and the ways in which it relates to science, reason, philosophy, and art. In short, Adorno is concerned with the remaining possibilities for self-determination, for unregulated experience which is neither standardized nor determined in advance, for accessing and generating culture and for social knowledge, that is, with the remaining possibilities for living life, given what the vision of life offered by bourgeois society, given that the vision of life offered by bourgeois society as an individual promise of happiness is rendered de facto unlivable by the existence of bourgeois society, where the prevailing and totalizing capital relation forms the backdrop of socially mediated domination, repression, and restriction both in general and in particular. Quote, private life is, more than we can even imagine, mere reprivatization. The realities to which men hold have become unreal. Quote, life itself is a lifeless thing, end quote. Das Leben lebt nicht. End bracket. End quote. Adorno. Quote, Das Leben lebt nicht, end quote, is placed as a motto before the first section of Minima Moralia. In the authorized English translation of the book, it is rendered as, quote, life does not live, end quote. This sentence is taken from a novel by the 18th century Austrian writer Ferdinand Kernberger titled Der Amerikamude, The One Who Grew Tired of America, a particularly resonant title for the situation in which Adorno found himself while working on Minima Moralia. Alexander Garcia Duttman notes that this motto's, quote, almost corny yet also emotionally moving turn against itself, end quote, can also be readily understood as a, quote, statement against Lebensphilosophie, end quote. Garcia Duttman. Kernberger's sentence, which, quote, sounds vitalistic and presumably was also once meant as such, becomes in the context of Adorno's philosophy the self-knowledge that the return of what is always the same can only be recognized from the perspective of what is different, end quote. Scheidt, 2003. I'm assuming that's Gerhard Scheidt. I'm not sure, though. The insight that life doesn't live any longer can be found almost word for word in Nietzsche's work. Quote, life equal vitality, the vibration and exuberance of life pushed back into the smallest structures, all the rest impoverished by life, The whole does not live at all anymore. The whole is cobbled together, calculated, synthetic, and artifact, end quote. Nietzsche. End footnote. In a 1952 letter to Leo Löwenthal, Adorno explains that this concern is with, quote, the concept of life as a meaningful unity unfolding from within itself, end quote. Adorno, which for Adorno, quote, has ceased to possess any reality, much like the individual himself, and the ideological function of biographies consist in demonstrating to people with reference to various models that something like life still exists, with all the strong qualities of life. And the task of biography is to prove this in particular empirical context which those people who no longer have any life can easily claim as their own. Life itself, in a highly abstract form, has become ideology, and the very abstractness that distinguishes it from older, fuller conceptions of life is what makes it practicable. The vitalist and existentialist concepts of life are stages on this path, end quote. Adorno to Löwenthal, 25th of November, 1942. I think it says 1952 earlier. I'm going to assume it's 1952 because that seems more like the time period that we're in. 8 years later, in October 1960, so it should be 1952 in the footnote. 8 years later, in October 1960, Adorno mentions that he is beginning, quote, to question whether the sentence, quote, life does not live, end quote, whether the non-existence of experience really applies today. Won't the explosion of catastrophe now release a much older horror? Is it not rather the case that what's new is the self-consciousness of these things rather than the things themselves, Standardization is the newest historical form of old untruth, of unreconciled generality, ultimately of mythical repetition, but only the fire of what is newest illuminates the darkness of what is ancient. End quote. Adorno, quoted in Tiedemann, quoted in Tiedemann, 1994. The old ever-sameness, which Adorno refers to as myth, stands opposed to a strong concept of experience, which would demand novelty, would demand that what is be more than merely what has always been, even when what has always been appears in fashionable costume. As Adorno writes at the beginning of Minima Moralia, quote, the relation between life and production, which in reality debases the former to an ephemeral appearance of the latter, is totally absurd. Means and ends are inverted. A dim awareness of this perverse quid pro quo has still not been quite eradicated from life. Reduced and degraded essence tenaciously resists the magic that transforms essence into a facade. The change in the relations of production themselves depends largely on what takes place in the, quote, sphere of consumption, end quote, the mere reflection of production and the caricature of true life, in the consciousness and unconsciousness of individuals. Only by virtue of opposition to production, as still not wholly encompassed by this order, can men bring about another more worthy of human beings. Should the appearance of life, which the sphere of consumption itself defends for such bad reasons, be once entirely effaced, then the monstrosity of absolute production will triumph. End quote. Adorno. As a consequence, Adorno describes the, quote, specific approach of Minima Moralia, end quote, as the attempt to present aspects of philosophy, quote, from the standpoint of subjective experience, end quote. According to this approach, quote, the state of society dominated by the instrumental rationality of economic calculation is measured with regards to the compromised and submerged possibilities of subjective reaction, possibilities to which subjects themselves are subordinated. End quote. Zeal, 2006. SEEL. Most of the aphorisms published in Minima Moralia in 1951 were written between 1944 and 45. These are located in the first two sections of the book. Also included in the final publication are another set of aphorisms originating between 1946 and 47, composing its third section. Footnote: in a 1950 letter to his publisher, Peter Zurkamp, Adorno writes that he views this third part as, quote, quote, incidentally, by far the most important today, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Zurkamp, 29th of September, 1950. On the origin of Minima Moralia, see Garcia Duttmann, 2004. And footnote. Together, these aphorisms explore the question of, quote, whether man was made merely to exchange, end quote, along with exchange itself, both as an action, but also primarily as a principle which has come to undergird the thinking and feeling of individuals, shaping individuals in exchange's own image, all the way down to their innermost being. In this way, the book also presents a model of solidarity with, quote, metaphysics in the time of metaphysics' fall, end quote, which Adorno later advances in negative dialectics, quote, the smallest intra-mundane traits would be of relevance to the absolute, for the micrological view cracks the shell of what, measured by the subsuming cover concept, is helplessly isolated and explodes its identity, the delusion that it is but a specimen, end quote. Adorno. In this passage, quote, mere specimen, end quote, refers not only to the object of knowledge, but also to the individual who is defined as a social object, an element of a negative totality. Quote, it has long been demonstrated that wage labor formed the masses of the modern epoch, indeed created the worker himself, end quote. Adorno. Taking this insight from Marx and Engels, Adorno applies it to the individual in general under existing conditions. This individual is, quote, not merely the biological basis, but the reflection of the social process. His consciousness of himself as something in itself is the illusion needed to raise his level of performance. Whereas in fact the individuated function in the modern economy is mere agents of the law of value. End quote. Adorno. Footnote. In Anti-Düring, for example, Engels writes, quote, that modern large-scale industry has called into being on the one hand a proletariat, a class, end quote. Engels. End footnote. In the, quote, modern economy, that is, in capitalism, the, quote, law of value, end quote, which features in Adorno's writings, quote, mainly in metaphorical form, end quote, uses individuals as a means to override individuals. Footnote. In Negative Dialectics, Adorno writes more specifically of, quote, Marx's Hegelian trained theory of the law of value, which capitalism realizes over the heads of men, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. End footnote. For its own part, this law has become total, quote, with the complete hegemony of exchange value, end quote. Its principle is that exchange of like for like, which extends itself all the way into, quote, the inner constitution of the individual, end quote, going beyond, quote, merely his social role, end quote, quote, only when the process that begins with the metamorphosis of labor power into a commodity has permeated men through and through, and objectified each of men's impulses as formally commensurable variations of the exchange relationship, it is possible for life to reproduce itself under the prevailing relations of production. End quote. Adorno. In Minima Moralia, Adorno takes this insight as the economy theoretical explanation of the preponderance of the general over the particular, which he would later criticize in Negative Dialectics. Quote, the objective and ultimately absolute Hegelian spirit, the Marxist law of value that comes into force without men being conscious of it, to an unleashed experience, these are more evident than the prepared facts of a positivistic scientific bustle, which today extends to the naive pre-scientific consciousness. Only to the greater glory of objective cognition. That activity breaks men of the habit of experiencing the real objectivity to which they are subjected in themselves as well, end quote. Adorno. Before the, quote, general course of the whole, end quote, dialectic of enlightenment, the individual is merely a function of the principle of exchange. Universal exchange limits the individual's actions as well as his impulses and feelings to the realm of the economic. Under the dictate of the exchange of equivalents, the arbitrary injury caused by this exchange necessarily has, quote, something nonsensical and implausible about it, end quote. For example, someone who gives a gift without expecting anything in return comes to be viewed with some suspicion, quote, as if the gift were merely a trick, end quote. Adorno. The ostensible friendliness appears as effrontery, as something that will in fact have to be paid back at some point, even if only because the recipient is, quote, unwilling to tolerate in the chain of exchange acts, whereby expenses are recovered, a single missing link, end quote. Adorno. The irritating gap caused by this missing link serves as a reminder of the not yet fully integrated particular, of the individual's individuality, yet at the same time is precisely the gapless, quote, chain of exchange acts, and quote, the constant circulation of values, niceties, and emotions, which constitutes the remaining life of individuals whose purpose is exhausted in their function as agents of the law of value. To cite one example of this, the president of Germany, quote, summoned an extraordinary meeting in Bellevue Palace, consisting of 12 philosophers, sociologists, political scientists, and theologians from all the world's important cultural spheres. For one day, they discussed what it is that still holds the world together in the first place, end quote. Before reaching the following conclusion, quote, society is dependent on giving and taking, end quote. Adorno. Cornelius, 2008. Cornelius, 2008. On the one hand, this anecdote may sound like a mockery of the efforts of those theorists, quote, from all the world's important cultural spheres, end quote, given that all they ultimately discovered was that the world is, quote, still held together by what has always forced it together at the expense of any number of victims. Adorno has recognized this basic insight, but the point for Adorno is, quote, to escape from this process of exchanging like for like, end quote. Adorno. Yet, on the other hand, the Realpolitiker president obviously revealed himself to be a rationalist. The instrumental deployment of giving wants to be equivalently remunerated, and means should not contain a, quote, surplus with respect to the ends. At the same time, however, no, quote, surplus at all is expected from the ends with respect to the means either. The idea of something achieved which does not offset the investment in its achievement, but is nonetheless rewarding, is regarded as irrational, and presumably even is. Not even rationality escapes blind application unscathed. New section, no happiness without fetishism. This is section 2 of the chapter. If the economy is once a means to the end of social reproduction, the two are one and the same today. By now, members of society are members of an economy, which is synonymous with everything, even with the relationships of individuals to themselves and others. Hence, as mentioned above, friendliness exists under, quote, a priori saleability, end quote, where, quote, the living has made itself as something living, a thing, equipment, end quote. Adorno. Quote, from genuine kindness to the hysterical fit of rage, end quote, everything previously alive has become, quote, capable of manipulation, end quote. Adorno. In order that the gift, which has nothing to do with its own concept, in order that the gift, which has nothing to do with own concept, it's a typo or something, I don't know, something freely given with nothing gained in return. As Nietzsche claims, quote, we acquire no rights by making gifts, end quote, Nietzsche, will yield the return already implied in its giving. Yet in contrast to how cultural pessimism would have it, this does not mean that all friendliness is simply fake. The situation actually is more dire. Although friendliness is indeed severed both from its, quote, instinctual basis and from the self, end quote, Adorno, it is still, quote, genuine, end quote. What alone stands in doubt is genuineness itself. Quote, among the concepts to which, after the dissolution of its religious and the formalization of its autonomous norms, bourgeois morality has shrunk. That of genuineness ranks high. If nothing else can be bindingly required of man, then at least he should be wholly and entirely what he is, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. A quotation from the 1950s reveals just how patronizing and authoritarian one patriarch was while seeking to instruct the following generation how to become a, quote, real person, end quote. Quote, confronted with the effective recognition of authority, the task of critique becomes to restrict this recognition in a rational manner in accordance with the intellectual growth of the recognizer. In all areas where critique is in effect, the mature human being is driven to revise opinions he has assumed due to his recognition of the authority of parents, friends, books, comportment in his surroundings, etc. However, there are also particular areas of life in which a free statement of personality must be able to come into effect to the greatest possible extent. Precisely the important decisions in the life of the human being cannot simply be handed over to the doctrines or advice of an authority. Self-reflection and self-determination must, for example, become the source of a human being's actual choice of religion, if this choice is to be the foundation of a genuine and responsible personality. For such decisions, critique must clear the way. In any number of other cases, it is critique's task to set boundaries on the influence of authority, end quote. Strohall, 1959. End footnote. The word genuine should not stand, quote, unquestioned, exempt from conceptual development, end quote. Is it not simply a constant, but rather something which changes depending on what it attempts to describe? While human beings may bear a number of deformities, human beings have no, quote, substratum beneath such, quote, deformations, no ontic interior on which social mechanisms merely act externally. The deformation is not a sickness in men, but in the society which begets society's children with the, quote, hereditary taint, end quote, that biologism projects onto nature, end quote. Adorno. If society has become its own ideology, then human beings are the way human beings are under capital, precisely because this benefits capital. In the aphorism titled Gold Assay, Adorno expresses this idea as follows, quote, the more tightly the world is enclosed by the net of man-made things, the more stridently those who are responsible for this condition proclaim their natural primitiveness. The discovery of genuineness as a last bulwark of individualistic ethics is a reflection of industrial mass production. Only when countless standardized commodities project, for the sake of profit, the illusion of being unique, does the idea take shape, as their antithesis, yet in keeping with the same criteria, that the non-reproducible is the truly genuine, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. This is an objection to Benjamin's essay, The Work of Art in the Age of its Technological Reproducibility, which declares precisely that the authenticity of the autonomous artwork has been rendered obsolete by reproducibility. End footnote. The possibility of leading an extra-capitalist, quote, niche existence, end quote, within society. Among leftists, the desire to lead such an existence finds expression in the notorious fantasy of, quote, moving off the grid, end quote, as well as in the notion of, quote, authenticity, end quote, which imagines, quote, that if I live in accordance with my own ethos, my own nature, or if, to use the fine phrase of our own time, I realize myself, then this will be enough to bring about the good life. And this is nothing but pure illusion and ideology, end quote. Adorno. If such a possibility even ever existed at all, has finally become history under the fully developed capital relation. Footnote. By now, this concept of authenticity has degenerated into an overused phrase. René Martens perceives in it, quote, the entire perspective of cultural pessimism held by those who no longer expect anything good from human beings, and therefore above all hold themselves to be good. What it demands is that which is original and natural, the unspoilt state, the primordial. In other words, all which is yet to be manipulated and fiddled around with by human hands, back to the roots instead of moving as far away from them as possible. Unquote. Martins, 1995. End footnote. Quote, although the alternative island of bliss, that is, practical self-organization, as the pedagogical boondocks of capitalism, soon came in on the waves of the environmental movement. They escaped neither the practical critique of more advanced corporate policy nor the far less destructive critical social theorists. End quote. Hofner. Footnote. Uwe Kurzbein does not want to accept this and would rather broadcast, quote, signals from the niche, end quote, which is supposed to secure Uwe Kurzbein a certain independence from society, typical of the, quote, off-the-gridism, end quote. Aussteigertum, described by Hofner. However, he suffers from a lack of money. According to him, quote, socializing the land, end quote, and creating, quote, means of production, hierarchy-free structures, self-responsibility and self-determination, end quote, against a, quote, predatory capitalism, end quote, demands an embrace of, quote, ecology, the economy, and social togetherness, end quote. Yet because he envisions this embrace not as an overcoming of the capital relation, but rather as taking place within the capital relation, it cannot happen without money. Quote, the critics tell me broadly and overwhelmingly that the communities also need money, end quote, Kurzbein writes. On this point, Uwe Kurzbein agrees, quote, of course they need money, and because they latently, end quote, and certainly also quite manifestly, quote, have little money, many conversations revolve around acquiring money, end quote. Uwe Kurzbein. How socially typical. People talking about money. Quote, however, Kurzbein reassures us, quote, great care is taken not to restrict voluntary activity, end quote. Kurzbein. Such activity is voluntary in the same sense that working is voluntary when one has to do so to earn money, and thus to operate as a member of capitalist society, which one already is anyway. A necessity for survival. End footnote. To borrow Adorno's words, these islands were, quote, washed away, end quote, by the totality of capitalism. It would seem that only what is of no use to capital, that is, what cannot be valorized, offers a way out by not letting itself be subsumed. Quote, the only cure for the half-uselessness of life, which does not live, would be its entire inutility, end quote, Adorno. In existing society where everything made has a purpose for which it was made in the first place, the inutility which resists all instrumental absorption through its uselessness, quote, occupies the place of that which can no longer be distorted by profit, end quote, Adorno. And for its own part, knowledge, quote, must be guided by what exchange has not maimed, or, since there is nothing left unmaimed anymore, by what is concealed within the exchange process, end quote, Adorno. Things are, quote, maimed by their purposeful production, and so, according to Adorno, quote, amid universal fungibility, happiness attaches without exception to the non-fungible. No humane exertions, no formal reasoning can sever happiness from the fact that the ravishing dress is worn by only one and not by 20,000. The utopia of the qualitative, the things which through their difference and uniqueness cannot be absorbed into the prevalent exchange relationships, take refuge under capitalism in the bracket fetish character, end bracket, end quote. Adorno. In times when no other happiness can be experienced, besides that which is damaged by the false whole, the reflection of falseness in happiness must be taken as a given. Here Adorno uses the term fetish character to refer to an aesthetic fetishism which is at times leveled as an accusation against the proponents of art for art's sake due to their, quote, concept of a pure, exclusively self-sufficient artwork, end quote. According to Adorno, this accusation may indeed be quite apt, yet the, quote, truth content of artworks, which is indeed artworks' social truth, is predicated on their fetish character, end quote. Adorno. Although artworks' truth content may also have something guilty about it, quote, the guilt they bear of fetishism does not disqualify art, any more so than it disqualifies anything culpable, for in the universally socially mediated world, nothing stands external to its nexus of guilt. Bracket, Schuld zu Zusammenhang. In bracket, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. According to Rolf Tiedemann, quote, the, quote, web of or context of guilt, end quote, and, quote, web or context of delusion, end quote, are concepts frequently used by Adorno in Adorno's theory of society. The meaning is sketched in his metaphysics, for example, in the course of a critique of the Stoics, end quote. Rolf Tiedemann. The passage mentioned by Tiedemann reads as follows, quote, but I would say that even this standpoint, nevertheless has a moment of narrow-mindedness in the sense that it renders absolute the entrapment of human beings by the totality. Thus sees no other possibility than to submit. The possibility of seeing through this situation as a context of guilt. Schuld zu Zusammenhang, concealed through blinding, bracket, Verblendungszusammenhang, in bracket, and thus a breaking through it, did not occur to that entire philosophy. Stoicism did, it is true, conceive for the first time the idea of the all-encompassing context of guilt, but Stoicism did not discern the moment of necessary illusion in that context, and that, I would say, is the small advantages that we, with our social and philosophical knowledge, enjoy over the Stoic position, end quote. Adorno. Quote, the concept of Schuld zu Zusammenhang may incidentally go back to Benjamin, end quote. Tiedemann. Translator's note. This final comment by Tiedemann appears to have been mistakenly admitted from the English translation of History and Freedom quoted above, hence the reference to the German original here. As Benjamin writes in the article Fate and Character, quote, law condemns not to punishment but to guilt. Fate is the guilt context of the living. Fate corresponds to the natural conditions of the living. That semblance, not yet wholly dispelled, from which man is so far removed that, under its rule, he was never wholly immersed in it, but only invisible in his best part, end quote. Benjamin. End footnote. For this reason, artworks are, quote, plenipotentiaries of things that are no longer distorted by exchange, profit, and the false needs of a degraded humanity. In the context of total semblance, art's semblance of being in itself is the mask of truth, ... A liberated society would be beyond the irrationality of its faux frais, and beyond the ends means rationality of utility. This is enciphered in art, and it is the source of art's social explosiveness. Although the magic fetishes are one of the historical roots of art, a fetishistic element remains admixed in artworks, an element that goes beyond commodity fetishism. End quote. Adorno. Adorno interprets this element as the precondition for breaking out of the ever-sameness of what has always been determined in advance. There can be, quote, no happiness without fetishism, end quote. Adorno. For, quote, autonomy and fetishism are two sides of the same truth, end quote. Adorno. Something of this view appears in Rene Magritte's dictum that a, quote, superior life cannot be conceived without genuine luxury, end quote. Magritte. However, the, quote, promise of happiness and luxury, end quote, also mentioned by Adorno in Minima Moralia, also refers to the economic realm which it cannot escape, given that luxury, quote, presupposes privilege, economic inequality, a society based on fungibility. Thus, the qualitative itself becomes a special case of quantification. The non-fungible becomes fungible. Luxury turns into comfort and finally into a senseless gadget. This vicious circle would put an end to luxury even without the leveling tendency of mass society, over which reactionaries wax sentimentally indignant. The inner constitution of luxury is not unaffected by what happens to the uselessness in its total incorporation into the realm of use. Its remnants, even objects of the highest quality, already look like junk, end quote. Adorno. As long as luxury continues to be eliminated, quote, but not by declaring privilege a human right, end quote. Adorno, and by realizing it as such. As long as the subjectively ashamed and objectively guilty aspect of luxury does not become obsolete, with luxury becoming accessible to all, so too will the capital relation deform luxuriousness when former luxury articles are mass-produced as standardized commodities, which is why even the genuine luxury article, whose lavishness is only certified by its price tag, appears just as ridiculous as the mass-produced commodities, like how formerly useless activities were integrated into the process of production as value-producing labor. However, if happiness, quote, attaches without exception to the non-fungible, end quote, yet the formerly non-fungible has become fungible with, quote, luxury turning into comfort and finally into a senseless gadget, end quote. The question emerges as to what happiness might be able to attach to for longer. That being said, usefulness, quote, cannot be separated from the process of integral socialization, end quote. Society still integrates efforts to escape society's totality, the usefulness of which, quote, can be defined only in terms of its negation, end quote. Adorno. As strength through joy, parenthesis, Kraft durch Freude. Footnote. Translator's note. Kraft durch Freude was a state-operated recreational organization in Nazi Germany. So I'm going to repeat that last sentence. And footnote. That being said, usefulness, quote, cannot be separated from the process of integral socialization, end quote. Adorno. Society still integrates efforts to escape society's totality, the usefulness of which, quote, can be defined only in terms of its negation, end quote. Adorno. As strength through joy, Kraft durch Freude. Escapism. In this way, even autonomous artworks which might transcend appropriation by the culture industry are already just as damaged by it as happiness is by horror. Quote, wrong life cannot be lived rightly, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Quote, incidentally, long after I have formulated this sentence, end quote, Adorno comments in his lecture course, Problems of Moral Philosophy, quote, I discovered a similar statement in Nietzsche, although it is very differently phrased, end quote. On the occasion of Adorno's 100th birthday, the literary writer Christiana Scherer mistakenly claimed that Adorno, the namesake of her pen name, Theodorn, was, quote, clever enough to create a legitimation for anything and everything with his notorious, quote, wrong life cannot be lived rightly, end quote, end quote. Tia Dorn. One can, of course, read and ultimately propagate Adorno this way, but Adorno's dictum does not in fact imply, quote, compromise with reality, but simply a recognition of reality, end quote. Liesmann. End footnote. Moreover, whoever attempts to live rightly after what history has borne witness to is already living wrongly or not living at all. If life is to be more than simply the ability to live, or a cheerful disposition, or, quote, an endless procession of bent figures chained to each other, no longer able to raise their heads under the burden of what is, end quote. Adorno. A procession entered into for the sake of sheer survival, even though it is a procession of the damned, quote, trotting towards the grave, end quote. Bush. Footnote. Ulrich Ralph's thesis that Adorno, quote, gifted the Germans one of their very few and probably their last philosophical book of folk tales, bracket, Philosophischen Volksbücher, Rolf, 2003, is grotesque. Hermann Kring's captured Minima Moralia's gesture and substance far better when Hermann Krings wrote in a 1953 review that it, quote, could also have been titled The Damned Society or even The Last Judgment, end quote. Krings. For a contemporary critique of Minima Moralia, see Demirovich, 1989. End footnote. Nevertheless, Adorno holds fast to the possibility of happiness in times of happiness's impossibility. Quote, what beauty still flourishes under terror is a mockery and ugliness to itself, yet its fleeting shape attests to the avoidability of terror. Something of this paradox is fundamental to all art. Today it appears in the fact that art still exists at all. The captive idea of beauty strives at once to reject happiness and assert it. End quote. Adorno. After all, quote, there is no longer beauty or consolation except in the gaze falling on horror, withstanding it, and an unalleviated consciousness of negativity, holding fast to the possibility of what is better. End quote. Adorno. Blemished by the ubiquitous necessity of valorization, and no longer possible as a state of blissful, thoughtless intoxication, happiness bears the antagonistic traits of the society which at once facilitates and obstructs it. Footnote. Quote, of course, the demand of soberness, ... takes something away, the happiness gained through drunken ecstasy. But does not this happiness only cheat us of another happiness which is absolutely denied to us in the world as it is? Kierkegaard's demand for sobriety is not that of the Philistine. Kierkegaard's demand for sobriety attacks the shams of mere individuality, of making absolute of accidental, quote, differences, end quote, and all the false happiness connected with them. Behind this sobriety lies the profound knowledge that in the last analysis, the differences between men are not decisive, for all the features of individualization and specification owe their very existence to the universal injustice, which makes this man thus and not otherwise, whereas he could be different, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Thus happiness can only be found in the remembrance of constantly self-perpetuating disaster. As long as this remembrance does not also pessimistically renounce the happiness which still wants to be everything. Quote, without historical remembrance there would be no beauty. End quote. Adorno. What fetishism is to art, lie is to truth. Quote, scattered traces, ... from the negative whole, end quote. Adorno. Quote, rationalization is not yet rational. The universality of mediation has yet to be transformed into living life, and this endows the traces of the immediacy, however dubious and antiquated, with an element of corrective justice, end quote. Adorno. It may be true that, quote, all post-Auschwitz culture, including its urgent critique, is garbage, end quote. Yet in the cultural sphere, ideas of freedom and justice that, unlike economy, are not based on the precondition of our relentless rationality, which has led to terrible disaster, seem to have formed anyway. If, quote, free and honest exchange is itself a lie, to deny it at the same time, to speak for truth. In face of the lie of the commodity world, even the lie that denounces it becomes a corrective. That culture so far has failed is no justification for furthering its failure, end quote. By taking up the position of cultural pessimism, which since the dawn of civilization has predicted civilization's demise, is but a day away. Footnote. Quote, culture is refuse, yet art, one of its sectors, is nevertheless serious as the appearance of truth. That is implicit in the double character of fetishism, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Footnote. Gerhard Henschel has succinctly demonstrated with select materials that the constantly necessary updating of the apocalyptic worldview, the world persists even after apocalypse was prophesied, does not make it more plausible. See Henschel 2010, end footnote. A far more valid task would be to redeem from culture what culture can also stand for. Quote, culture is only true when implicitly critical, and the mind which forgets this revenges itself in the critics it breeds. Criticism is an indispensable element of culture, which is itself contradictory. In all criticism's untruth, still as true as culture is untrue. Criticism is not unjust when criticism dissects. This can be criticism's greatest virtue, but rather when criticism parries by not parrying, end quote. Adorno. That being said, culture's truth is not positive. Rather, culture's truth can only be established in culture's absence. The only avenue remaining is the critique of untruth. In his introductory lecture course, Erkenntnistheorie, Epistemology, Adorno addresses the question of, quote, what the deal might be with my concept of truth anyway, end quote, explaining that it, quote, consists of the fact that simply everything that exists at all is understood in terms of the tension or the contradictions between the existence of the phenomenon which is spoken of and the concept it has of itself, or, if this manner of speaking is too subjective for you, of the concept under which it appears, and the difference which emerges through this confrontation, or in other words, the proof that no thing does justice to its concept. This difference, this negative, is the only way at all in which we can become aware of truth if we don't want to absolutize a finite, if we don't want to hypostatize a conditional, end quote. Adorno. That is, quote, if on the one hand, truth must be conceptualized as socially mediated, but on the other hand, society can't do justice to society's own concept, namely the concept of justice, then truth would indeed consist precisely of the fact that this proof is not held up against society abstractly and is something outside of it, as something from a fully furnished abstract utopia. Instead, truth involves society being confronted with its own concept of justice in the form which it has as ideology, so to speak, a movement from which society's own untruth emerges, in actuality in the movement of these concepts, in the transition of the concept, and ultimately in the course of a praxis which wants to go beyond society's untruth, something like an idea of truth is actually constituted. End quote. Adorno. Critique of untruth thus becomes the task of a theory suited, quote, to the almost insoluble task, end quote, of letting, quote, neither the power of others nor our own powerlessness stupefy us, end quote. Adorno. After all, quote, fear of the impotence of theory supplies a pretext for bowing to the almighty production process and so fully admitting the impotence of theory, end quote. Adorno. Even in Marx's work, signs can be found of an unacknowledged capitulation before overwhelming circumstances, and a theory which escapes both immediate valorizability and rote acquiescence must criticize this capitulation. Quote, traits of malice are not alien even to authentic Marxist language, end quote. Adorno. New section, section 3. What is deceptive about dialogue? In one of his very last notes, written in July 1969, Adorno comments as follows, quote, long have Marx's mannerisms of speech been suspect to me. If only an incisive critique of the whole theory on the basis of language would be made. For example, the derivative rhetoric and imagery, does this not bear witness against Marx from the perspective of the philosophy of history? From the perspective of the philosophy of history. According to his and Hegel's logic, Marx's inability to find the words for what he meant would have to prove that the world spirit they trusted was not with him. End quote. Adorno. The most illustrious example of the, quote, derivative rhetoric, end quote, Adorno cites here may well be located in the fetish chapter of Capital, where Marx reveals himself to be unable to expound upon the fetish character of the commodity without resorting to unclear metaphors and analogies. The problematic metaphoricizing adoption of the term fetish from ethnology can itself be seen as the first instance of this. Moreover, where precise phrasing would seem to be in order, one finds puns and personifications, somewhat ambiguous imagery, anti-bourgeois rancor, and a schoolmasterly rhetoric with which Marx repeatedly strives to uncover so-called economic, quote, secrets. Footnote. In examining the relative form of value, Marx claimed that, quote, the coat, unquote, selected as a general example along with the linen out of which it was made, is a, quote, bearer of value, unquote, although this property never shows through, even when the coat is at its most threadbare. In its value relation with the linen, the coat counts only under this aspect, counts therefore as embodied value, as the body of value, bracket Wertkörper, in bracket. Despite its buttoned-up appearance, the linen recognizes in it a splendid kindred soul. The soul of value, end quote. Marx. End footnote. Footnote. See, for example, the claim that, quote, commodities are in love with money, end quote. Marx. End footnote. Footnote. Take, for example, the claim that, quote, we perceive straight away the insufficiency of the simple form of value. It is an embryonic form which must undergo a series of metamorphoses before it can ripen into the price form, end quote. Marx. Or that, quote, the price or money form of commodities is like their form of value generally, quite distinct from their palpable and real bodily form. It is therefore a purely ideal or notational form. Although invisible, the value of iron, linen, and corn exists in these very articles. It is signified through their equality with gold. Where am I? Fuck. Where am I? I'll have to repeat that quote. Or, quote, the price or money form of commodities is, like their form of value generally, quite distinct from their palpable and real bodily form. It is therefore a purely ideal or notational form. Although invisible, the value of iron, linen, and corn exists in these very articles. It is signified through their equality with gold, even though this relation with gold exists only in their heads, so to speak. The guardian of the commodities must therefore lend them his tongue, or hang a ticket on them in order to communicate their prices to the outside world, end quote. Marx. End footnote. Footnote. See, for example, Marx's mention of the, quote, crude bourgeois vision of the political economist, end quote. End footnote. As justified as Marx's critique and as revolutionary as the substance of Marx's theory may be, they sometimes amount linguistically to an overwrought polemic. An example of this can be seen in Marx's treatment of other authors in the German ideology, many of whom are, quote, maliciously embarrassed, end quote, therein. And that quote was from Adorno. Footnote. Indeed, more than a few Marx researchers have appropriated his hostile style of argumentation while mutually accusing each other of not having understood Marx, even though they allege he propounded his theory as clear as day. These philological disputes regarding the perfect reading of Marx are probably less useful to social critique than to the formation of factions in which it is possible to be indisputably correct. End footnote. Adorno's note continues as follows, quote, "The fact probably noted by Lukács that the proletariat was not the most advanced class, but rather as a dehumanized class, was regressive and backwards, would only fit all too well here. Just take a look at the hymns and the revolutionary poetry. Moreover, the backwardness of the proletariat allowed its integration into bourgeois society." End quote. Adorno. Indeed, as Marx and Engels themselves note in The Holy Family, private property, quote, "produces the proletariat as proletariat, poverty which is conscious of its spiritual and physical poverty, dehumanization which is conscious of its dehumanization, and therefore self-abolishing," end quote. Marx and Engels. The evident consequence from the perspective of the philosophy of history that the proletariat would not be suited for revolution was abandoned by Marx and Engels in favor of the thesis that the proletariat would overturn existing relations once it finally championed its own interest. However, they neglected to interrogate which imposed interest it might have in the first place. Writing to Thomas Mann in 1952, Adorno suspects that, quote, "Perhaps it was the inconspicuous weakness of Marx, though one of the implications of which can hardly be exaggerated, that Marx did not truly and substantially embody in himself the culture against which he struggled." Marx's language, particularly in the period of his maturity, strongly suggests something of the kind. And when he effectively dissolves the tension between the utopian and positivist elements of his thought in favor of the positivist elements, thus anticipating the way in which socialism itself would eventually become another part of the machinery of production, this is surely connected with a curious blindness to the moment of semblance, without which there can be no truth. I fear that this is where the church fathers of dialectical materialism proved to be all too bourgeois themselves, ... But one can hardly say this sort of thing today without inviting misunderstanding. And if one does say it, one is immediately likely to be misused by those who simply claim to defend culture against materialism. End quote. Letter from Adorno to Mann, 1st of December 1952. Adorno elaborates on this view of Marx as, quote, "all too bourgeois," end quote, in his lecture course, Philosophische Terminologie, or Philosophical Terminology, from the 1962 to 63 winter semester. According to Adorno, Marx had, quote, "in the bourgeois egalitarian traits which he inherited, just as above all in his idea of increasing productive forces, that is, in the reckless domination of nature, certain ascetic traits himself. These are manifested particularly crudely in certain astounding formulations in the Communist Manifesto on erotic matters," end quote. Adorno. See, for example, the following passage from the manifesto, quote, "Our bourgeois, not content with having the wives and daughters of their proletarians at their disposal, not to speak of common prostitutes, take the greatest pleasure in seducing each other's wives," end quote. Marx and Engels. End footnote. Culture has to be negated not abstractly but rather determinately, as reconciliation with nature. This requires a dialectic which Adorno views as lacking in Marx's work, particularly in Marx's later writings on the critique of economy. When Marx, who Adorno believes, quote, "fought against utopias, ... may even more than was good," end quote, quote, "used philosophical motifs to complete the transition from philosophy to economy," end quote. Adorno. Marx became for Adorno, quote, "in a certain sense more positivist, scientistic, and undialectical than Marx was in his writings from his youth, the manifesto included," end quote. Letter from Adorno to Jürgen von Kempski, 27th of January 1950. As Michael Heinrich emphasizes, Marx, quote, places capital among the, quote, scientific attempts to revolutionize a science, end quote. Heinrich. And that quote was from a letter from Marx to Ludwig Kugelmann, 28th of December 1862, and footnote. This stands in contrast to the conception of science and critical theory, for which, according to Adorno, as Michael Heinrich emphasizes, Marx, quote, places capital among the, quote, scientific attempts to revolutionize a science, end quote, and hence did not criticize, quote, the so-called positive sciences, but rather believed himself to be in agreement with them, end quote. Adorno. This stands in contrast to the conception of science and critical theory, for which, according to Adorno, quote, science is one among other societal forces of production and interwoven with the conditions of production. Science itself is subject to that reification against which critical theory is arrayed. Science cannot be the measure of critical theory, and critical theory cannot be science as Marx and Engels postulated it, end quote. Adorno. From the article on the specification of critical theory, unpublished translation by Henry Pickford, available at academia.edu. End footnote. Of all things, critique cannot spare the rationality accorded to which both the understanding of science as well as society as such are constituted. On the one hand, science is itself a productive force, yet on the other, science is essentially a part of culture. For Adorno, insofar as Marx does not reflect upon this, Marxian theory stands in danger of itself becoming part of that ideology which is inseparable from society. Quote, the less ideology stands out, the more directly ideology becomes the objective spirit under which we are living. So it is no longer a theoretical construct. Ideology is now neither the idealization of something existent nor its complement, but rather the existent as appearance, the existent in the guise, reflected in the total social consciousness, and thus objective spirit. This spirit is now infiltrating language most of all, which is why, if I may just say something subjective about my own approach, I think, and the work of Karl Kraus is already an excellent example, the ideology critique today is not so much a critique of an explicit, theoretically false content, as simply a critique of the form in which certain content is expressed in the social consciousness, a form that contradicts the actual issue in question. And that, I would think, is why language critique is now really the appropriate form, or at least one of the appropriate forms of ideology critique. End quote. Adorno. Footnote. Quote, the analyses micrologically attained by Kraus are by no means so, quote, unconnected, end quote, with science as would be acceptable to science. More specifically, Kraus's language analytical theses on the mentality of the commercial traveler, of the future office worker, must, as a neo-barbaric norm, concur with those aspects of Weber's theory of the dawning of bureaucratic domination which are relevant to the sociology of education. In addition, Kraus analyses also concur with the decline of education explained by Weber's theory. The strict relation of Krauss's analyses to language and their objectivity lead them beyond the promptly and automatically recorded fortuitousness of merely subjective forms of reaction. The analyses extrapolate from the individual phenomena a whole which comparative generalization cannot master, and which is co-experienced as pre-existent in the approach adopted by Krauss. Adopted in Krauss's analysis, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. According to Adorno, Krauss's critique of language is essentially true of, quote, liberal speech, end quote, or in other words, quote, of the malediction that everyone having the same right to communicate became injustice in fact and in expression. Certainly Krauss limited himself to criticizing liberal speech just as little as the society in which he lived was purely liberal. Not only did Krauss perceive the process of putrefaction under both total domination and the forms of objective spirit, which imitated. The third Walpurgis Night already contains the phrase, quote, it's all right, or, parenthesis, get in Ordnung, in parenthesis, a self-contentedly inhuman form of communication which only today, after Hitler's downfall, has transformed into popular speech, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, quote, better for those campaigning for autarky to speak bad German than to use foreign words they can never really understand. For example, dynamic or synthesis is precisely the attempt to replace them that has led to that enrichment of German vocabulary, which is the envy of other nations. But this enrichment also results from the expanding needs of trade and commerce, a development which, at the end of the day, justifies the unthinking adoption of Jewish idioms and an acceptance of the inflated patois or patios, P-A-T-O-I-S, of profiteers already in vogue among Republican authors. So now all variants of the primal soul's awakening can claim to be, quote, 100% guaranteed, end quote, with, quote, expedited delivery, end quote. Krauss. End footnote. In language, bourgeois coldness condenses as an indifference towards every interaction, which stems from the fact that no instance of speech, regardless of its substance, is presumed to be any different from any other. Under the banner of legitimacy of domination, free speech, a German interior minister, whose job should involve checking right-wing extremism with the resources of the state, can respond to a question about how to deal with neo-Nazis by asking the following question, quote, when was the last time you or I spoke with a right-wing radical, end quote. Footnote. Former Interior Minister of Saxony, Heinz Eggert, quoted in Drosta, 1995, end footnote. This reinterprets a social problem as a failure of speech while conceiving of communication as an end in itself, as therapy and service in one. Footnote, quote, a magic word, indeed the magic word, and apparently the cloudy remains of the legacy of the Christian concept of communio and the socialist concept of communism, end quote. Henscheid, 1993, end footnote. In the process, linguistic, quote, shoddiness that drifts with the flow of familiar speech is taken as a sign of relevance and contact. People know what they want because they know what other people want. Regard for the object rather than for communication is suspect, end quote. Adorno. Communication is itself shot through with the coercive principle of like for like, even when it presents itself as non-coercive and free from domination, given that, quote, the word communication itself implicitly contains a neutralization which makes it appear to refer to nothing more than that some people communicate something to others, inform them of something, regardless of the fact that in the forms of this communication, the entire historical relationships of power are constitutively contained. Adorno, in his aphorism titled "How Nice of You, Doctor," Adorno issues what it probably is his clearest statement regarding the recurring demand for non-violent and non-hierarchical communication. End footnote. The hypocrisy of communication, quote, what is deceptive, the hypocrisy of communication, quote, what is deceptive about dialogue, end quote, results in the ideology of free togetherness, parenthesis, freies Miteinander. However, under given conditions, togetherness is no more free than its value inherent. Quote, declaring togetherness as such the goal indicates that one has forgotten about the substance of community, a humane arrangement of the world. The cult of community as an end in itself belongs to the National Socialist and the people's democracies in the Russian style, is essentially totalitarian. Within it, the tendency towards the oppression of the individual constantly resonates. However, a real community would be one of free human beings, end quote. Adorno. That is fucking fire. Sorry, gotta copy that down. The delusion that community is already real is evident among other places. The delusion that community is already real is evident among other places in one pseudo-democratic admonition which poorly disguises itself as a request while legitimizing every appeal to inhumanity as free speech. Quote, the stock phrase, quote, would you let me finish, end quote. Bracket, darf ich mal ausreden, and bracket, end quote. Footnote, see Schultz 2001, end footnote. Woe betide us if not, for this would namely expose the this would namely expose the quote so-called democratic common sense, which is neither democratic nor common sense, end quote, for what it always was, a quote deal, in which someone demands to have his opinion heard in return for allowing another in good faith to speak. Pacta sunt servanda. Free expression requires free individuals which do not exist at present. What instead exists are subjects who exchange opinions, and when people speak of exchanging opinions or information, this is not merely a metaphor. Exchange really does take place, and this means that the relevant rules must be followed, rules which, among their other functions, uphold the illusion that language as well must bow to the dictate of rationality, if it wants to mean something. Quote, now that demythologization has led to the destruction of language itself, end quote, all speech which does not positivistically consent to reality is consigned to, quote, poetry, end quote, while only a, quote, threadbare language, end quote, remains. Footnote. The following passage from Adorno's article, Theses on the Language of the Philosopher, from the early 1930s, quote, the demand for the, quote, understandability, end quote, of philosophical language for its societal communicability is idealist, necessarily predicated on the significative character of language. It posits that language is separable from the object insofar as the same object could be adequately given in different ways. Objects, however, are not at all adequately given through language, but rather adhere to language and stand in a historical unity with language. In homogeneous society, the communicability of philosophical language is never demanded. It is nevertheless everywhere imposed. If the ontological power of words is so extensive that objective dignity is attributed to them in society, this objectivity never results from an adjustment of philosophical language to societal communicability. Rather, objectivity, which renders language, quote, communicable, end quote, is the same as that which unambiguously assigns words to the philosopher. It, die Objektivität, cannot be demanded. Where it has become problematic, it is essentially non-existent, and is little predetermined for the philosopher, as is only to be registered in society. The abstract idealist demand for the adequation of language is to object, and society is the exact opposite of linguistic reality. In atomized, disintegrated society, constituting language by taking audible being into consideration romanticizes a state of the ontological obligation of words to feign, a state, that is instantly denied by the impotence of the words themselves. In the absence of unified society, there is no objective language, and therefore no truthfully communicative language, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. As the, quote, difference between language as a means of communication and language as the precise expression of the matter under consideration, end quote. Adorno has been flattened. This threadbare language is supposed to be equally suited to everything. Hence the, quote, unfortunate existence of a word for everything, end quote. Schmidt. Even for the unspeakable. In reality, however, it simply obscures everything. Meanwhile, quote, public life has reached a state in which thought is being turned inescapably into a commodity, and language into celebration of the commodity, end quote. Dialectic of Enlightenment. This has resulted in a, quote, highly gelatinous heap made of new agey and zeitgeisty rubbish, of pretentious verbal muddle intended to simultaneously obfuscate and mock, or alternatively made of fear, end quote. Henscheid. Or, in other words, in a language which reflects both the social and the private, both the objective coercion to work and the simultaneously objective superfluity of the individual. Quote, it wants to seem impressive, this language in which work and leisure slide into each other. It wants to be meaningful and relaxed, very, very relaxed, downright forcibly relaxed. It makes one casual and confident, suggests superiority, is yet nevertheless subject to the most hideous trends. Everything sounds like advertising. Quote, we're paving the way, end quote. Quote, it's well underway, end quote. Quote, we have a handle on it, end quote. Precisely, language is kept in a stranglehold by people who perform the role of acting. Handelende. Or Handelende. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Handelende. Determining subjects. End quote. Drosta. Subjects use mutilated language to present themselves as individuals while merely fulfilling their function as, quote, users of stock phrases, end quote. Rudolph. This has led Michael Rudolph, or Michael Rudolph, to view as historically superseded Adorno's observation that for many people, that is, for those who have been completely absorbed in their social determinacy, quote, it is already an impertinence to say, quote, I, end quote. Adorno. Quote, we used to be able to justifiably find fault with the fact that many people found it presumptuous to say, quote, I. This has taken on a new quality in that these people can no longer even unambiguously say, quote, yes, or quote, no. Today, quote, exactly, quote, correct, or quote, nope, not really, end quote, sputter out of them, end quote. Michael Rudolph. Language expresses a social stupidity which presents itself as desirable cunning. Quote, after all, quote, in present society, the ego or self has become such a burden to many people because by thinking too consistently and vigorously, they cause themselves all kinds of inconvenience. They avoid being, quote, too clever by half, end quote, and find it more appropriate to reality not to develop their ego too far, in keeping with the old Berlin saying, quote, you're lucky, you're stupid, end quote, end quote. Adorno, footnote, on the thesis that, quote, stupidity itself has been taken over by fungibility, end quote, see Adorno 2007A. I don't know what that is, what 2007A is, but I'm not going to look it up now. The, quote, public now only communicates in phrases, end quote. The, quote, inflationary accumulation of imposing and intimidatory blather, end quote, reveals, quote, human beings, end quote, panic at their own insignificance, at not being able to keep in the everyday hamster wheel of post-industrial debasement, end quote. Rudolph. The panic is justified, and in the struggle of each against all, language too is a weapon both in the general struggle and in the struggle against one's own downfall. Stupidity, including the stupidity of language, quote, is not a natural quality, but one socially produced and reinforced, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Adorno thus stood in the humanistic tradition of great French Enlightenment thinkers such as Helvetius, who wrote that, quote, man is born ignorant, he is not born a fool. And it is not without labor that he is made one, end quote. Helvetius. End footnote. However, quote, stultification is caused not by the oppressed but by oppression, and it affects not only the oppressed but their essentials, the oppressors as well. In their essentials, the oppressors as well. Sorry, I'm going to repeat that whole thing. However, quote, stultification is caused not by the oppressed, but by oppression. And stultification affects not only the oppressed, but in their essentials, the oppressors as well, end quote. Adorno. Adorno sees the world as immersed, quote, in a gloomy flood of nonsense, the fallen form of language. Karl Kraus compressed that fact into the thesis that today the phrase gives birth to reality, especially to that reality which arose after the catastrophe under the name of culture, to a great extent that reality is ... only there to keep men away from what is of importance to them, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. As Kraus wrote, quote, the world is deaf from intonation. I am convinced that events no longer even happen anymore, but rather that cliches keep working automatically. Or if events should actually happen without being repelled by cliches, then the events will stop once the cliches are shattered. Matters have gone rotten from language. The age already stinks of the phrase, end quote. Karl Kraus. End footnote. The dialectic of language, another essential, quote, element of the total process of enlightenment, end quote, entails language's double character as, quote, as a means of discursive significance, of communication first and foremost, on the one hand, and as expression on the other, end quote. Adorno. Meanwhile, Adorno's attempt to find a language which does not reduce itself to one of these functions is itself dialectical. Quote, best able to meet the demands of this predicament would be a philosophical language that would strive for intelligibility without confusing it with clarity. As an expression of the thing itself, language is not fully reducible to communication with others. Nor, however, is it simply independent of communication. Otherwise, it would elude all critique, even in its relationship to the matter at hand, and would reduce that relationship to an arbitrary presumption. Language as expression of the thing itself and language as communication are interwoven. The ability to name the matter at hand is developed under the compulsion to communicate it, and that element of coercion is preserved in it. Conversely, it could not communicate anything that it did not have as its own intention, undistracted by other considerations. This dialectic plays itself out within the medium of language itself. It is not merely a fall from grace on the part of an inhuman social zeal that watches to make sure that no one thinks anything that cannot be communicated. End quote. Adorno. And that's the end of chapter 8. Thank you so much for listening.